You're listening to Myers-Briggs Question Corner with Edythe Richards. Hello listeners, welcome to another episode of Myers-Briggs Question Corner. We're so glad you're tuning in for this important and very relevant topic, personality type and bullying. This is the second of a three-part series we're doing to bring awareness to workplace bullying in particular. Now, in part one of this series, which we aired last week, we talked about the definition of bullying and got into some of the effects of bullying, as well as why some people become bullies at work. Edythe also talked about the correlation of the Big Five, personality, inventory and bullying, which was interesting to hear. But what I find truly interesting is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of information out there on Myers-Briggs types and bullying. Isn't that right, Edythe?
Right, David, and a big hello to our listeners and thanks for tuning in. Right, so I did talk a bit about the correlation of the Big Five to the Myers-Briggs, but at the end of the day, they're really two different assessments that are looking at different aspects of personality. And what we want to do today is to get into a bit more detail about personality types who bully and discuss on an anecdotal level if this might have anything to do with Myers-Briggs types.
Yes, I see. And if you're tuning in, this is surely something you're waiting to hear Edythe's take on. If I could just take a step back for a moment though, just to mention a vital point you made in the last episode, Edythe, about workplace culture and bullying, and the personality of the culture of the organisation. Could you give a quick reminder to our listeners on that?
I sure can, and I want to cite the Workplace Bullying Institute here on this. The biggest factor and predictor in workplace bullying isn't an individual's personality, it's an organization's culture. And what I find particularly disturbing, although not really surprising, is that despite policies in place and training to mitigate bullying and what to do if you're a victim, the targets of bullying are often unwilling to report it. And I've witnessed that more than I care to remember. This also brings up the fact that HR offices or human resources offices and personnel aren't always equipped to deal with allegations and support employees who are targets of bullying or effectively address the perpetrators.
That's disturbing indeed. And we talked about this before. The bullies seem to get rewarded for their behaviour, promotions and such like. And then there's the issue of some people questioning whether the incidents are, in fact, bullying. I mean, let's face it, bullying has been going on for centuries, and there seems to be this school of thought that victims of bullying are just too sensitive and need to suck it up. And perhaps the bullies themselves behave the way they do because they assume others can take it.
Right, so much to process there. Bottom line, there need to be effective policies in place that clarify acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and these policies need to be implemented and communicated in a way everyone can hear and understand. And that means confidentiality and privacy issues need to be addressed. If someone's getting bullied at work and doesn't report it for fear of being ostracized or fired, that's a huge problem. This is going to lead to health problems, concentration problems, increased absences, and ultimately disengagement and turnover. And that's costly to an organization. So obviously the organization needs to be mindful and proactive in these matters because it's becoming more of an issue and it's not going to do anyone any good to sweep it under the rug.
Well, very clearly, there's a lot of room for improvement here, Edythe. Let's get into the anatomy of a bully. Who are they? What are their personalities like?
Okay, full disclaimer, I'm not an expert on bullying, but I do have a lot of consulting experience and experience in corporate HR. I've led workshops on this topic, and I've got degrees and certifications in counseling and psychology, but most importantly, I've counseled hundreds of people on this matter, admitted bullies themselves, people who were accused of being bullies, and victims of bullying. So I'm going to speak from those perspectives. Let's start with the behaviors of bullies and then move on to personality.
Okay, great. Behaviors of bullies first.
Right, so here are some common bullying behaviors. Yelling at someone publicly, or supporting them privately but demeaning or disgracing them publicly. talking about someone behind their back with the sole purpose of damaging their reputation, ignoring them, or giving them the silent treatment, or dismissing them, or withholding information, making the other person look bad so they themselves can look good, blaming the other person for their problems, sidestepping questions and getting angry if confronted. Generally, a bully is condescending, exploitive, and manipulative.
And we want to make this distinction, as we've talked about last time, that bullying is intentional and pervasive. Bullies often single out specific people, and is deliberate, intended to cause harm to someone. We don't want to confuse this with rudeness or spite, or just a disagreement or disliking someone.
You are absolutely right, David. And that goes back to what I said about having clear policies in place, because it's something that can be easily misconstrued.
And when we're talking about behaviours, many of us, myself included, tend to think of bullying as overt criticising or yelling or intimidating people or obvious threats. But it can be subtle as well, like minimising the effect they have on people, or pitting co-workers against each other, or excluding someone. I think you said that. But it could also be rationalising their behaviour, couldn't it?
Yes, I've seen that behavior listed before, and I have to agree with it. If you have a CEO or a senior executive who believes in leading out of fear and demands certain behaviors out of their employees and then justifies their own style, when it's clear they're actually undermining the work of their team, or they're taking credit for their work and making their staff feel intimidated, or using them as scapegoats to the point that these people aren't able to work productively, I would say the experts would agree that's a sign of bullying.
But it happens all the time.
Yes, and it's truly unfortunate.
So what about personality then? What I think our listeners really want to learn is, are there certain Myers-Briggs types who are more prone to bullying?
Well, this doesn't tell the whole story, but it's easy to say that ESTJ or ENTJ types are the most obvious culprits, because their very nature is to focus on the logical analysis of systems and things, not the effects of their style on people. These folks want to make decisions that are rational, to control outcomes as much as possible. It's knowledge and objective measurements, not how someone feels, that matters at work.
Yes, we've talked about this style before, and how they aspire to leadership roles, for better or for worse. But Edythe, that surely doesn't mean that these are the personality types most prone to bullying, does it?
No, absolutely not. Every personality type has healthy and unhealthy versions. We want to be clear here. Personality and behavior are two different things. Now, ESTJ and ENTJ types, or TJ types in general, so I'll add ISTJ and INTJ types, may be the type of bully to be overly critical. They may hold their employees to impossibly high standards and find flaws in their work, and they may be the biggest voice in the room. They may shout their disapproval. They may enjoy humiliating others or humiliate others without knowing they're doing so, because they're so focused on their own needs. ESTJ and ENTJ types are often perceived as aggressive and arrogant, but also charming in their own way. Those who are in leadership positions probably have gotten there because they're popular and they know how to play politics.
When I think of bullies in the workplace, this is what I think of. People who go out of their way to put or keep systems in place at the expense of the people doing the work. Productivity and efficiency are what's important. Showing feelings is a weakness that will not be tolerated. Or they look down on people, thinking they're better or more intelligent, or that others are incompetent. But like you said, Edythe, that's not necessarily bullying behaviour.
Right, it can become bullying behavior though, if left unchecked, or if the perpetrator gets off exerting their own power and control, and if their behavior is intentionally and pervasively condescending, exploitive, and or manipulative.
So like you said, Edythe, ESTJs and ENTJs are the obvious culprits. But when you talked about bullying behaviours, there were some that don't really fit into this personality type, at least from my view.
So again, any Myers-Briggs type can be a bully, and for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with personality type. So let's take a look at some other types of bullying behavior, and this one is one that's often cited in pop culture: cliques. We think about cliques as the popular kids at school, but they're in the workplace too. These bullies purposefully exclude others. So, for example, the targets don't get the information needed to do their jobs, or they don't get exposure. And again, it's purposeful exclusion, picking on a particular person or a group of people for their own subjective reasons. Now, this sounds an awful lot like unhealthy ESFJ or ENFJ behavior. Extroverted feeling types naturally pick up on societal norms and what's expected, and they have a keen ability to say the right thing to change someone's mood. And if we remember, feeling types can be very vindictive. So if someone isn't behaving in a way the extroverted feeling type thinks is appropriate, they can become passive-aggressive or overly critical and exclusionary, bullying their targets for being weird, for example.
And since you mentioned feelers, Edythe, I'm going to cite a previous episode we did called Feeling and Thinking Misconceptions. And that can shed some light onto this issue. As we're talking about cliches, I can't help but recall the movie Mean Girls. And there are all sorts of examples from TV shows and movies. And these type of bullies could be the gossipers too, or the ones who steal your work, or take credit for your work. But like you're saying here, Edythe, it's not uncommon to see people at work using aggressive tactics as a means of getting information or getting themselves seen. What actually makes it bullying behaviour is when a pattern emerges. What we're talking about with these bullies are the things that they do purposely and often to certain people.
And like many bullies, they may be very popular and have a lot of influence. And that brings me to another type of bully, the prankster. These are the folks who want to bring fun to work, but their definition of fun often crosses a line. For example, an office prank gone too far that can cross into harassment. What was once funny can become unkind, and sometimes these prankster behaviors can walk a fine line between being fun and being downright mean.
I'm remembering the stapler, stuck in Jell-O in the Office series. Now, it's fun for TV, and it might be a fun laugh in some offices too. But you can see where a case needs to be made for professionalism. And I imagine these types of pranks do not have a place in most corporate settings.
Right, and if I have to correlate this to any Myers-Briggs type, it would be the SP types, ESTP, ESFP, and ISTP especially. I can make a case for ENTP types as well. They're looking to be entertained or they're attention-seeking, and their pranks can start out fairly innocently but can easily get carried away, again, if no one puts a stop to the behavior.
Back to your point about policies being enforced. What about deliberately sabotaging your work or undermining everything you do?
It's very common, and I'd say a lot of people who use these tactics don't associate it with bullying, or they may not even realize it's bullying behavior. Adults who behave this way often do so for the same reasons children do. They're insecure. I've never met a bully who wasn't insecure, and that includes bullies of my own Myers-Briggs type, which is ENFP. We are not immune to bullying others. I'll cite an ENFP female bully I know who used a lot of emotional manipulation to try to boost herself and her accomplishments up in front of the people in charge, throwing others under the bus in the process. And it all came down to her feeling threatened and that she thought she wasn't getting enough credit for her work.
Edythe, this does bring up another distinction, and we could have a whole episode and many more on this one. And that would be male versus female bullies.
Yeah, interesting you brought that up, David. So, according to the Workplace Bullying Institute, 58% of workplace bullies are female, and 80% of the time, their targets are other women. And if we think about it, a lot of bullying behavior at work are behaviors associated more with females than males, like gossiping or sarcastic comments or being sickly sweet behind closed doors and then slamming you publicly, and the emotional manipulation that I mentioned. Many women, once we reach the top, want to help other women succeed, and others, whether they realize it or not, perpetuate the stereotype of a jealous, catty woman who judges and criticizes other women in a demeaning way.
Yes, this is something we could really go on and on about. But I guess in the interests of our listeners, I think we should wrap it up here and provide a few key points from this episode. Edythe, what's the one thing you'd like listeners to remember based on what we've discussed today?
Any personality type can be a bully, and bullies behave the way that they do for reasons that have nothing to do with the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator.
And with that, we've come to the end of another episode. Edythe, many thanks for your expertise, which hopefully will bring more awareness to the ongoing issue of bullying at work.
My pleasure, David.
Many thanks for tuning in. In the podcast notes, I'm going to cite previous episodes that can provide insight on some of these issues at work. Thinking and feeling misconceptions, which Myers-Briggs type earns the most money, and the most rude MBTI. All of these are available on iTunes, Player FM, YouTube, and wherever you like to get your podcasts. One quick favour. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to give it a share with others. And please follow us on your favourite platform so you don't miss another episode. Next week, we'll conclude this series of Myers-Briggs and bullying with part 3, where we're going to talk about personalities of the victims of bullying and what they can do to put a stop to the bullies once and for all. I'm David, producer for this podcast series, wishing you well. Until next time. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear more, or you'd like to submit a question yourself, then you can find us at www.atopcareer.com. Until next time. MBTI and Myers-Briggs are registered trademarks of the MBTI Trust.